So anyhow, the lecture tonight is titled, it's a favorite of mine, it's titled Cross-Cultural Naakaii Influence on Enslaved Navajo Weavers. And that's kind of a mouthful, but that's really significant, probably because it's one of the more interesting and more poorly understood categories in Navajo weaving. And Mark's brought typically a lot of material here to kind of like tell that story. And I've got kind of a cool story too. This is why I jumped at the opportunity to introduce Mark, because a long time ago in 1980, I was a college student in Austin, Texas, and I had a part-time job working in a gallery that sold contemporary Navajo weavings, pottery, jewelry, kind of stuff we're all familiar with here in this area. And at the time, that gallery invited a guy to come and give a talk on historic Navajo blankets. And that guy was Mark Woodard. And the funny thing is, well, he's working on it. I was maybe 19 at the time, and Mark wasn't even 30. And he shows up in a cowboy shirt with a yoke and tight jeans and a ponytail all the way down his back, and he's got the coolest stuff I'd ever seen. I like Navajo weavings, but I really like the old pieces. I looked at those and I thought, God, these things were witness to history. Many of them predated history, in fact, the history of the West that, as a kid I was really taken with. Apache Indian Wars, Little Bighorn, all the things that you hear and well, we had things that were, much earlier than that. So I was really transfixed with it. And the thing that stood out, he had what you would expect, chief's blankets, probably Navajo serapes, but he had a really interesting blanket. It was a white superfine blanket with dark blue indigo patterns picked out on it. And this is a really interesting thing. That one got me, and I remember in the course of this, I asked him about that blanket. And he was eager to tell me things that went way over my head. For one, it looked kind of like what would be called a Saltillo serape today. And when I was 19, I'd never even heard of a Saltillo serape. But the irony is, I believe, and I could be wrong, the blanket that he had with him in 1980 might be this one or one very, very close to it. But it looked like that.
That one came to be newer than those ones.
Okay, but it had those colors.
Yeah,
it looked a lot like that.
Yeah, I have a few like that.
So I still remember that thing today, and I can still picture him, too, from all that time. Anyhow, cut to the chase, that was a slave blanket, and certainly I'd never heard of one of those. I didn't know what that was about, and he wasn't telling that story back in 1980 yet. But he was telling people that were intrigued what he thought it was. At any rate, tonight he is going to kind of crack that nut. So fast forward 46 years, is that really true? I think it is. Later, Mark is the preeminent authority, on Southwestern textiles. He probably knows more about this stuff, has a better eye than anyone alive. So take advantage of that, ask this man questions. He will tell you more than you wanted to know. That's almost guaranteed, at any rate. So I could go on, but he'd be driving me off the stage because I'd like to tell this story. But anyhow, I'll turn it over to him.
Thanks a lot. Yeah? Well, thank you. Just one quick question. How many of you were here 2 weeks ago? Let's see, show of hands. Oh, that's a pretty good mixed crowd, so good. So I didn't bore you then last time. Okay, good. Well, so we are going to talk about, slave weaving tonight and what we call slave blankets. And in a way, the talks got booked backwards because I think I should have talked about Navajo weaving first, and then this, because that's an overall study. That will be tomorrow's thing. You really don't want to miss it. I've been a Navajo rug dealer for 55 years. I have fabulous Navajo blankets, in case you don't think these are nice enough. And I'll have first phase. I'll have a fabulous poncho. We'll have really great stuff. So tomorrow night should be a lot of fun. Also, with a total different topic, and those of you that did come here, you've seen me kind of line these tables several times now. I just don't want you to think I don't have any more. So, anyway, I wanted to say that, and so we had already booked it before Davison and I thought about it, and so he thought it was too late to change the order around. I think it would have been slightly more cohesive, but that's just fine. We'll do just fine tonight. So anyway, this will be the first talk you come to about slavery that is not about slavery. That's my least favorite part of the story. And so I have to tell a little bit about some interesting historical things I've come up with that I think you'll find interesting, but I am what I call a material culturalist. That means what I care about is the material culture that came out of the different cultures of the Southwest. So I'm really about the textiles themselves, and they tell their own story. So I'm going to concentrate much more on that. But when I remember in my mind a cute little story, I'll probably throw in something about Navajo slavery you'll find interesting. But basically, that's my least favorite part of the story. This is a work in progress. I bought my first blanket, well, my first unusual Saltillo style blanket in 1977. We're going to look at it in a minute. And it was a Mexican serape, and I was in La Mesa, or La Jolla, California, and I bought it from the Sky. And I didn't really look at it. I just thought it was kind of cool, and it was a few $100s. And when I got it home, I looked at it and it had lazy lines all through the field. Now, lazy lines is a Navajo trait, and this is a Mexican blanket that shouldn't have that Navajo trait. And then I started looking at the ends, and it was continuous warp, which is a Navajo loom. And I thought, what the hell do I have here? So I quickly ran up to Boulder, Colorado to see my mentor, Joe Ben Wheat, and showed him the blanket. And he just kind of went, oh my. And so his comment to me that day was, if ever there's a Navajo slave blanket, this is it. And so that got me going. And so since 1977, every blanket I've ever looked at, I've sold 25 or 35,000 blankets. I own several thousand. So every blanket I've ever looked at, I've had that idea in my mind that those existed. And so I've always looked at things kind of through that eye. And I now have about 100 of them, and I've been working on a book and researching it. The book will come out in early 2028, and I have arrangements with the Museum of New Mexico to open a slave blanket show on the plaza in January of 2028. And that's exactly where I wanted it. I kind of played hard to try to get that slot in that location to start the show, because right across from the plaza of the History Museum is where they sold Navajos at public auction on a very regular basis. And so that's just part of history. And so because I've been researching so much, reading so many books, doing so many things, my brain is like overamped with stuff. So if I tend to wander around a little bit, it's because I will be wandering around a little bit. So one thing I always encourage the crowd, ask questions. Don't let me go on and on before the question doesn't mean anything, because I like to keep the talks I do relative to the crowds that are there and what people are thinking. So please don't be embarrassed about raising your hand. I might put you off for a half a second if I want to finish a point, but I'm very interested in what the audience wants to know about. So if I skip over something too fast, if I say something too, I misspeak about something, so just please be participatory in the whole thing. Okay, so let's see. So I did have to take a couple notes just so I could remember to stay on topic. Now, slavery is not a unique concept. Most people are very surprised when they hear about Navajo slavery. They go, what? I never heard about that. Now, this is just a small handful of my books that are about Navajo slavery that I've been reading lately. And I have plenty more. So people say, never heard of it. I'm going, well, I don't know what book you read about the Southwest, but they're in every one of that book, and sometimes pretty profusely mentioned. And so I've then gathering information. This is one of 3 volumes that I have right now of the just research material on slavery. And so this is what I'll call the book, I think, it's when it gets on cross-cultural, which is the Naakaii, or Hispanic, influence on enslaved Navajo weavers. Naakaii is the Navajo word for Hispanics or Mexicans, and it means the wanderers. And so how the Navajo first saw the Spanish was this big group of wanderers that kind of wandered through. They didn't know they had a home in Mexico City. They didn't know anything about who these people were. They just wandered through. So the term is the wanderers. And so with intermarriage between Spanish and Navajos, which Navajos are totally the most casual people in the world. We've lived out on the reservation for almost 30 years now, and run a trading post and bought rugs from over 8,000. We bought over 8,000 rugs. We probably only dealt with 500, 600, 700 individual weavers, but so it was a kind of good time to learn all about sort of Navajo culture. And so the Navajo clan is called Naakaii Dene, so that means it's a mixture of Naakaii, and the Mexicans and the Navajos. And so we have, in our weaving area, we have 3 different families that are Naakaii Dene. And so what that basically means is if you could go far enough back in their families, there's probably a common relative, but it could be 8, 10 generations back. And really, in the Naakaii Dene, probably not as much as any of the other clans like Maidishkizi or Nashusha or Kinlachini or Kia'ani. Those other clans are more pure Navajo, but Naakaii Dene. And they really didn't have any problem with that. There is, you know, Maidishkizi is Jemez Pueblo, Nashusha is Hopi Tewa. And so they welcomed other people into their life system as long as they lived by Navajo rules. The only people that didn't get a clan were what the Navajos call the Belaganas, and that's us. And that mainly happened because of the first meeting, which was August 31st of 1849, between U.S. military and Navajo. They pulled out guns and shot the 13 leaders of the Navajo, and that pretty much ended it. And that incident happened about 3 or 4 miles in front of our trading post. And the leader at that time was named Narbona. He was 83 years old. And we might have heard of his great-grandson before, a guy named Hosteen Claw. And so the family of Narbona and Claw live in our weaving area. And I still have weavers from that family that weave for us today. And oh, by the way, this is my lovely wife, Linda. I better not get by without introducing her. And she'll help me hold up rugs and stuff. And you know, she's heard so many of my talks, she could do most of them. But the last time I did a talk on Navajo slavery was after doing a lot of business with Larry Frank. I don't know how many of you actually knew Larry Frank, but I did quite a bit of business with him in the 70s and in the 80s. And I sold him a slave blanket. And his son, Ross, who was just fascinated by it, and he kept asking me questions about it and talking about it. And ultimately, he became a professor at University of California at San Diego. And in 1995, he had me come out and do a talk for him on slave weaving because he thought it was so fascinating, and it kind of tied into some of the, you know, curriculum of what he was working on at the time. So anyway, you know, the slavery was like it was a human thing. It's not. A lot of Hispanics I talked to are kind of sensitive about the fact that there was Navajo slaves, but really, humankind has always had slavery. I mean, there's things built by slavery we call part of the 7 wonders of the world. I mean, without slavery, there wouldn't be a Great Wall of China. Without slavery, there wouldn't be the missions in California. There wouldn't be the pyramids in Mexico, or you know. And so, you know, it's just a part of human nature, and it's not the best part of human nature, and it's a real huge kind of hotspot political issue now, but it was just a way of life. And so it's always easier to have somebody else do something for you than do it yourself, you know. Seems to be kind of a human trait. So anyway, when the Spanish arrived up in the Southwest, all they thought of the Southwest was, my God, we can get all these people to work in our mines, because working in the mines had destroyed a lot of the indigenous populations in Mexico, because it was just a lot of work, and so they were running out of labor. And so when they hit the Southwest and all these new tribes and stuff, they thought this was like a treasure trove. And at first they took Navajos to the mines, and they kind of realized that these people were different than the native groups that they were really getting in Mexico. These guys were smarter, and they were, you know, just more on top of everything. And so the Navajos going to the mines didn't really last very long. They thought they had better things for them to do. And you know, they would become domestics. And then obviously the weaving issue comes in. We'll deal with that a little more in a second. But basically the men were considered stubborn and lazy. And so, because they didn't want to, you know, be slaves. And so they didn't make very good slaves. So it mostly became the women and children that were really taken. And the men were a little too much trouble to deal with. So anyway, probably, you know, Abiquiu is a huge part of Navajo slavery. It's considered a Henazado, it's not a Hispanic village, it's a Henazado village. And that basically refers to Native Americans that were captured from whatever tribe, and they got their freedom somehow. And so that is the roots of Abiquiu. They do not consider themselves Hispanic, they consider themselves Henazado. And more communities in New Mexico are going after that. And it's kind of funny to me, because you get like Tierra Maria, you know, they were always, we're pure Spanish, we don't want any white people here, when the hippies came around and everything. And you think about Truchas and Trompas and El Valle up above Chimayo and that, and they didn't want anything to do with any of these white guys. We're pure Spanish. Well, then along comes 23andMe, and they start getting tested. And they find out a lot of cases the Spanish is the least part that they are. They're more Native American and things. And so this is something that's causing a lot of change. And you know, now these quote unquote Hispanic villages are applying for Native American rights and Native American money from the US government. So it's kind of a shift in what's happened here, that of what they're realizing and stuff. So anyway, it's part of the story is a group of Navajos picked up on a slave raid. And the slaving trail was really from Abiquiu. If you've ever driven out Highway 96 towards Cuba, well, it's a pretty nice road. It wasn't a tough way to go. So when you get out to Cuba, you hit 550. If you go a little bit north, by that time you're already kind of in the Bisti Badlands. And so from there you can kind of go right straight across the Bisti, and you're at the Chuscas, and that's Navajo land. And so that was the main route. And so someone, whether it was Native Americans or Spanish or something, picked up a group of Navajos. And they stayed several days or weeks or whatever at Abiquiu. And then they were being taken down to Santa Fe to be sold at public auction, which is what they did, you know, gone, right on the public plaza. And so they got attacked by a group of natives, of another tribe of Native Americans, and those Navajos got killed. And when the survivors of that got back to Abiquiu, the head of the Catholic parish was infuriated about the whole situation. And so what he was so infuriated about is they didn't take care of the souls of those people. If they would have baptized them, their souls would have been saved. Then they could have killed them, it would have been fine, right? But they didn't baptize them. So that started a really big thing of baptizing all Native Americans that came through Abiquiu. And in those baptismal records, they say what tribe they're from, they say who they're the property of, you know, and things like age and other incidentals that weren't as more important as who they belonged to and stuff. And so that started it. But it actually started before then. So the first Navajo mentioned in the Catholic Church records was 1694. And so there's a guy named David Brugge, I believe he's gone now, but he made it kind of his life work of going through all those baptismal records. And he found literally thousands of Navajos listed in the baptismal records. And so he did most of the New Mexican parishes. Now there's a guy, Esteban Galvez, who was our, he worked for the state. He was our state historian, exactly. And so he's up working in San Luis Valley now, which was another huge stronghold of Navajo slavery and that trading. And, you know, everywhere there was work and things to do, they wanted labor. And so I think it's kind of good for us to talk kind of about the traits. One way when we look at textiles to try to determine whether they're Rio Grande, whether they're a possible Saltillo, those were basically similar style looms, or native looms or something, is by the, first off and foremost, is the weaving traits. Now the Hispanic loom, which we have a big example of in the show, I don't know what the say is, but you know, the warps are strung up, and so they can be much longer than the size of a piece. So you can weave several pieces on one warp stringing. The indigenous loom is a continuous warp loom, and you know, I meant to bring one and left it on my front porch. And so it was adapted by the Anasazis. The first early Anasazi loom was a backstrap loom where they would put up two rods and string warps in between, and they would attach the rod to some point higher on a tree or a building or something, and then they would have put a strap around their back. The weaver would kneel down, and by kneeling and leaning away from the front, they created what's called the tension, the warp tension required to do the weaving. And so sometimes, long before the Spanish arrived, that loom adapted from a backstrap loom to what we call a simple frame loom. And that simple frame loom is what the Navajos used to weave. We have a small example in the gallery here to show what that is. But on that piece, the size of a piece is determined before it's woven. So with the continuous warp, the warp is strung until, and then they get the size, and then they string that up and have the tension. And the Navajo or the Pueblos first adopted. The Anasazis first used it, the Pueblos adopted it, the Navajos adopted it from them. And it's kind of believed by most historians that date was sometime between about 1600 and 1650 when they adopted to it. Historians used to believe it was the Pueblo revolt that caused that, because the Pueblos revolted in 1680. All the Pueblos got together and chased the Spanish out of New Mexico. And it wasn't a pretty picture, and they killed the priests and chased everybody out. They went down kind of El Paso or a little further, I think. And then in 1693, the Spanish came back, and that's what they call reconquest. And so by that time, the Pueblo Indians were already weaving on the primitive upright loom, and the Navajos adapted. Historians used to believe it was that time when the Spanish came back that a lot of Pueblos left the area because of the harsh treatment of the Spanish, and that was where the cultural interchange happened for the Navajos to learn to weave. Joe Ben Weed, who was kind of my hero and mentor, really felt it was earlier than that they had learned, because, you know, by 1700, the Navajos are being given accolades for their abilities to weave, and he didn't think they could have learned that quick. It was just a little bit too fast. And so that was what he always felt. And so, you know, and I got to spend a lot of time with him. He used to dig in Yellow Jacket, which is up north of Cortez, and I lived kind of near there, and I used to go up and visit him a lot. I'd go see him. And I was just this kid that got lucky and found a lot of really cool blankets. I found a lot of things he's told me that didn't exist. And I'd bring it, and he'd go, only you, Mark, would do that. And so, you know, he used to always say that, you know, they talk a lot about the Navajos raveling cavalry uniforms, you know, to get the color. Well, cavalry uniforms weren't red, and that's the color they mostly raveled. And so he said, well, they never really raveled blue. Well, I found a beautiful Navajo child's blanket with all blue raveled in it. And so I said, cavalry uniform, Joe. He said, oh, you, I hate you. But I donated it to the museum. I thought it was kind of a fun piece. So anyway, so, you know, with the traits, we see the two different looms. The Hispanic loom, doesn't have continuous warp, and so it'll have cut warps at both ends. Those cut warps could be tucked back in and hidden and make it look like a Navajo blanket. And within the things, particularly in this category that comes off of the different looms, there seems to be an attempt to kind of disguise what loom they came out of. Like off the Navajo loom, they have a lot of Hispanic traits. Off of the Hispanic loom, they have a lot of Navajo traits. And so that's one thing I haven't really rectified in my mind why they would do that, but it sure seems to be true that they did. And so as we go through the pieces, I'll show you things that have, so what the Hispanics did on their loom was they bundled their outer warps. And sometimes it was a single warp, sometimes it was multiple warps. I've seen 6, 8, 10 bundled warps. The concept of that is when they're throwing their weft around the outer warps of the piece, with bundled warps, you could put a lot more warp tension on those warps, and so when you were pulling it, it didn't pull the piece out of shape. And so on a Navajo loom, they usually had single outer warps, and then they had selvage edges. And so that selvage edge was the same thing. It was a multi-cord, 2 or 3 cord, and those were usually 2 or 3 plies. And so those served for that same purpose, is you could put a lot more warp tension on them. So when you were weaving the piece, you didn't pull it out of shape. And so these are different solutions that came up being solved on different types of looms. And so that cultural interplay, I think, is just really interesting to me. And so the loom is one real consideration as far as traits that show us where the piece came from. You know, the other thing is the design. The Navajos use a different design style than the Spanish did. Oh, here we go. And so Joe always considered this, he always considered that the basketry came first and the blankets came later. So he thought, he was concluded that the designs used in a Navajo basket were what was first used in Navajo blankets. And so we see 2 different designs in this basket. We see bands and we see what are called terraced half diamonds. And Joe considered blankets that only use those 2 elements pure classic. It's a term he didn't really use to many people. He didn't like the term late classic. So he had classic, transitional, and then regional. Those are the 3 types of Navajo blankets. But for another type of blanket that he sort of isolated, he called them pure classic. And the pure classics only contain bands and terraced triangles. And I'll show you those designs in here, but those he considered Navajo designs, and of course a lot of designs developed from it. And here is, you'll be able to tell why I failed art school. So here, and so these designs are called terraced or stepped. Pardon my bad drawing, okay? But those are achieved by, you know, staying around a single warp for however many wefts you want, and then stepping to another warp. And sometimes the step over the warps could be, you know, any number of things depending on what you want, and we'll look at that in better examples. So Hispanic design was primarily serrated. or diagonal designs. And those are achieved by either picking up or dropping a warp every time you run across with a weft. And so that will create my next beautiful drawing. And so that's what you get. Tell me if I need to talk a little louder too, if you're okay. Okay. And not if you're hard of hearing. And so these are serrate, and so that's Hispanic designs. Most of the things you'll see in our room in the fancy room, I call it, is in the saltillos. You'll see they're almost all serrate design, but that's not exclusive. I have saltillos that are terrace design too. So we always have to remember that the weavers didn't read all these books that we now read, and they did what they felt to do rather than trying to stick with any culture. So here's another group of it, and this is what we call fine scale terracing. And so in a sense, it's kind of a blending of design because you get the diagonal design of a serrate, but you're stepping wefts, okay? And so most of the early Navajo blankets are large-scale terracing, and we'll see that tomorrow when I show you pieces there. Now, so here's the next development of a design is from the terracing that we saw is diagonally connected blocks. Now that is still considered terracing because it's stepped, but they no longer connect the same way as the first one I showed you. Well, I've already lost it. But these are diagonally connected blocks. So that's a little later development in Navajo designing. So when we see that, that helps us date. We don't see 1820, 1830 Navajo blankets that contain diagonally connected blocks. Most people don't kind of look at it and think about whether it's a simple terrace or it's a diagonally connected block. So here's another one that comes in a little bit later, and that is what we call terraced meanders. So this is something that doesn't come into Navajo design system until, into the 1860s or so. And so here you see the idea of it there. I just elaborated a little bit to show you. I apologize for my terrible drawings, but anyway, so here's the early stepped. And then the other thing we see enter about that same time period is crosses. And so we see the typical cross like that. We also see Spider Woman crosses. These were not in the Navajo design vocabulary much before 1860 at the very newest. And really 1865, they didn't do these. And so there's a lot of theories why. I mean, the Navajos saw plenty of Spanish crosses and things, but they never used the design in their vocabulary. And all of a sudden, and this is my theory, of course, they started losing. As long as they were fighting the Spanish, they basically were winning, and they could go back to their own territory. But when they started losing, they sort of decided, maybe those guys, we're losing because those guys use crosses. Maybe we should use the crosses. And so another interesting thing, which I'll show you a really beautiful poncho tomorrow night, but they started putting, and so the Mexicans wore ponchos. And we can see a lot of most all saltillos, 95, 98% of all saltillos were ponchos. And so that was one thing in my analysis form I always looked for. And if it was sewn up with a later thread, a different thread or something. So we know they were originally open. And then we would see sometimes wear or something. So several things when I was looking at saltillos. And I went over this for the first talk, but when I got really hooked, I bought my first saltillo in 1977 also, and I loved it. And in 1981, I bought the white book, Jeter book, the Santa Barbara book. I bought that whole collection. And in 1988, I got hired by Bob Bishop at the Museum of International Folk Art to curate his quincentenary show on saltillos. And so Jeter's book said there was only 200 saltillos in existence. And so I told Bob, I said, there's only 200 of them. I'm going to know all about saltillos if I just go look at all 200 of them. And so fortunately, for the wonderful people from the Folk Art Museum, the Rio Grande book said all the places they went and looked at stuff, and they mentioned in that book where they saw Mexican serapes. So that's where I started out my little Saltillo trail, I called it. And Bob thought it was great. He gave me a big stack of Museum of Folk Art stationery. He goes, write any museum you want, tell them whatever you want, go see them. Boy, his curator was not happy with me. She never did like me because she thought I should be more controlled. Bob said, I think this guy will do a good job. So anyway, I found all 1,100 of the 200 that existed. And so I did in-depth analysis forms. We photographed them and everything, and we literally, we were doing a book on them, but we don't have a book anymore. We have a huge database of information. We know how many of each type and everything are in every museum in the country. I wrote 300 European museums. I got a big book on European museums, and I went through it. Anywhere they said they had, you know, North American textiles or Native American textiles, I wrote them. And since I bought the Saltillo collection, I also got the book. So I was afraid to ask them if they had a Saltillo serape because I'm afraid they didn't know what it was. So I sent about 300 or 400 books all over Europe to any museum that they had it. And one of the funny things is numerous museums sent me back and said, we would never have anything from Mexico in our museum. I kept those letters. So anyway, I think my phone is trying to talk to me, so let me just make sure it's shut off here. So anyway.
Mark, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
So the Navajo weavings, the slave weavings that we're seeing, the Navajos were weaving parallel to the slave weavings. The
Well-
Navajo weaving technique was in full blast.
Well, yeah, so.
Some timeline.
Well, they were utilized, you know, the Navajos that could weave, and I'll get into it a little bit more, were captured. So they were weaving for an owner, somebody that owned them and probably dictated what they did. And so, but they were the unlucky ones, of course. Most of the Navajos managed to keep their distance from being captured, and but they kind of kept their distance. Now, people talk a lot about the Hispanic influence on Navajo weaving, or the Saltillo influence on Navajo weaving. If you owned a Navajo weaver, you had a lot of influence, you know. And basically a slave blanket represents the relationship between the captive and the captor. Because if you owned a Navajo weaver and you wanted a blanket, you had to make it for you, right? But then your wife might make one, so you dictated something different to them to make. But they were dictating the pieces that they made. In some cases, people probably didn't even know what a Navajo blanket was, and they just said, go make me one of those things you make so I can sell it. But a Navajo weaver in 1865 was bringing $500 at public auction. Now, you could buy a ranch in New Mexico for that much money. So that's how valuable they were. And so one of the Spanish governors in the late 18th century writes in his report back to the Viceroy in Mexico City, you know, they wrote about every kind of aspect and things that were going on in Mexico and everything. And when he gets to the Navajos, he says they work their wool with more delicacy and taste than the Spanish do. So they realized they were good, okay? A few years later, Fernando Chacon, who was the governor of New Mexico, takes it a step further. And I think this was 1783 or something. I don't remember the exact date. Anyway, in his tirade about the Navajos raiding and they're stealing our horses and our sheep and cattle, and they turn around and run back to their own country, and there's tens of thousands of them, so we can't really retaliate. And after he's done with his tirade, he takes it a step further and says, but the blankets they weave are the single most valuable trade item in our provenance. And so although that was quite a compliment, it actually became the curse. Because if the Navajo blanket is so valuable, how valuable is the Navajo that can produce a bunch of them? So, you know, if you make one for your wife, you make one for your kids, you make one for everything, then all of a sudden there's surplus, and those surplus can be sold. Now the other really, oh, yes, ma'am.
Are the weavers male and female?
No, well, in our 8,000 rugs we bought, about 5% have been from males. But historically speaking, males did weave, they've always woven, but they usually would give that blanket to a female, you know, person that the traders were more used to buying from. And so the lady would just say she wove it. And that was pretty common. Now, Hastings Claw was probably the most famous male weaver of all time, but he had a Hopi grandfather that taught him how to weave. So he learned how to weave when he was really young. So when I don't want to get too sidebarred on what his story was, but he lives in our weaving area, and we still buy rugs from members of his family now. So, so a fellow named James Sherman was the first kind of male that in essence came out of the closet to become famous. And he did weaving demonstrations, you know, in different galleries and stores in Scottsdale and things like that. And he was a really good weaver. And he learned from his stepmother, Clara Sherman, and Clara was kind of our main informant for the book. And she was a hoot, boy. She made me her last rug at 96 and died at 98. And so I do talks on just our trading posts and stuff, and I have tons of Clara Sherman stories. She was a hoot, and I just can't describe how she was smart as a pistol, a great weaver, and was really kind of a treat. But she taught James, and James, we got to the post, we took over the post in '97, and unfortunately it was claimed to be a hit and run accident. But there were some kids out drinking in Shiprock, and him and a couple buddies of his were walking down the road, and he was a drinker too, and they swerved, is that a good word? Swerved, okay. So they swerved over to kind of scare the Navajo men that were kind of staggering there, and they lost control of the car, and they ran him over and killed him. And so they took off. And so when they got home, you know, the mom came out and said, well, what happened to the car? It's got a big dent in it. And he said, oh, he hit a cow and he did this and that. And she was a little smarter than that, so she started checking, and eventually they did catch up with him for doing it. But it was a shame. So he only wove for us for about 3 years in the time we were there. But he was really nice. He was very quiet, but really good weaver. So.
Mark, you mentioned that, what percent was it that are weavings made by men?
Well, for what we bought in on our last 30 years, they're 5%.
Okay. So if you, how do you know that, I guess is what I'm asking.
How do we know that?
Now, how do you know they were not done by men?
Well, because the men brought them and sold them to us.
Oh, you're talking more contemporary.
Yes.
Oh yeah, we're talking about our time, our 30 years at Totalina. But you know,
There's no characteristics in this.
No, there's no male characteristics in it. They're all using the same loom and the same things. But you know, there's sometimes because we are aware of some male weavers that do weave today, and there's sort of artistic considerations that you can speculate on, I say was probably the best we could really say. So anyway, what happened to my little deal here? So anyway, you know, the loom, the design we've talked about a little bit, and then the third really big consideration for traits is coloration. So there was different coloration was popular with the different cultures. You know, red, white, and blue was the typical Navajo coloration. We don't really know why it happens to be the same colors as the American flag, and it's coincidental, but we don't really know. The Hispanic, you know, as you see the Saltillos, they were used to a lot more coloration. They had more access to dyes and the colors. And after, you know, synthetic dyes were discovered in 1856 for silk and 1857 for wool. And that was a $1 billion worldwide business. Those dyes made it everywhere. Joe told me that he found synthetic dyes on trade guias, which are the trade manifests for goods coming up from Mexico in 1860. So within 3 years. And those dyes got everywhere, basically. And, you know, we didn't know they run, we didn't know they faded, you know, they don't have the integrity of the natural dyes, but they were popular, and so they did it. And so you see a lot more wide variation of color, and you'll see tomorrow night, our Navajo blankets won't have this division of color, so these really show sort of that cross-cultural trait.
So Mark, you've talked a lot about how the dyes run, and yet you have this incredible collection of pieces without run.
I don't let them run.
Well, I know.
No,
I
no,
mean,
these
so
do.
this is a percentage of how many pieces?
Well, it
must
can be,
there
it
that-
can be cleaned out.
Oh, they can be, okay.
Certain colors can be, like blues and greens, you can't, it's pretty much ruined the piece. But the reds, the oranges are, you know, can be cleaned out. But before that, you know, a lot of the things were, you know, cochineal or lac dyed and indigo dyes that don't run. So, but mostly these kind of push right to the tail end of that period. So anyway, one of the biggest problems with slave blankets is their total lack of documentation. You know, if you had a Navajo weaver and you had to make you a blanket and you were going to take it to your rich friend to sell it, you didn't say, hey, buy this blanket my slave made. Because you just told the guy you had no money in it. So, you know, you kind of cut your own price by doing that. So, you know, so that's a sort of facetious idea of undocumented, but basically it wasn't popular or something to mention the Navajo slaves. And so when the Rio Grande book came out from the Folk Art Museum in 1979, there are only 3 documented examples of slave weaving. And so those are very scant. Like in San Luis Valley, there was a blanket called a wedge weave that was made by a lady, and they know her name. And then there was one made in Abiquiu for a child's bed that we know of. And I can't think of what the third one is right now, but there was only 3. And so since 1979, we've probably found about 12 more. Estevan Galvez, who somebody seemed to be familiar with, great-grandmother was a Navajo slave. And he has 3 blankets that she made. And so I'll show you a couple documented things. And if you go into the Luna Chapel and you look at kind of our slave blanket wall, at the far end, there was a white blanket that's pink and red stripes. That is the very best documented slave blanket that exists. And that lady escaped from Bosque Redondo, and she was headed back to Denata, which is the Navajo land. She was on the south side of what's I-40, and she was out near Estancia, and she ran into some Hispanics on a salt gathering expedition. And so they grabbed her up, and they took her down to the Manzano Mountains and kept her as a weaver. She was 25 or so years old. A 25-year-old Navajo in 1865 was a weaver, because we don't know, you don't know if you'd even get yourself a husband if you couldn't weave him a nice warm blanket. And you know, the thing that I always say about this is, you know, 1865 was before they put heaters in pickup trucks. Okay, so you needed a good warm blanket, because you're sitting up on that horse and it might be a nice warm 30 degrees, and that sun goes down, it's 30 below. And so everybody that traveled around the Southwest had a wearing blanket. And if they didn't, they probably ceased to travel because they died and froze to death. So when you think about it like that, so that's why the blankets were so important. They were totally necessary to life in the Southwest because of our, you know, we have a very unique climate here with that, at the high altitude. So anyway, Harry Mira was the first person that really published something on Navajo slave weaver. He was the curator at what was called the Laboratory of Anthropology that is now MIAC. And so those guys were involved in a lot of really interesting things in those days. But he published a book, surprisingly, and of course it's a little pamphlet. I have, you know, 8 copies. You'd think I could have found one in my messy office to bring tonight to show you. But why don't you get rid of these for me if you could. Let me just find one thing here. Here it is. So oops. So Mira published this book in 1938 called Navajo Slave Weaving. It's a little pamphlet. And in it, he shows 6 examples of slave blankets, but none of them are documented. It was his opinion of what slave blankets were. And I think he was right on. I think that guy was super smart and he did pretty good. And so there's another Mira book, I think, if you can find it, if not. But anyway, Mira published this in, I think, 1949, but he shows a couple blankets of that. He was a slave blanket guy, so he believed in them, and he shows a couple of them. So this is another book that Mira did, and this is on the Alfred Barton collection. And in here, there's a couple of slave blankets. Let me see if I can just find them. Here, so here's this little chapter on slave blankets. Here's what's similar we have here. And I affectionately call these that we're going to get to bubblegummers, because they remind me of a bubblegum thing that has all the colors in it, you know. And so this might tick nerve, especially like the one right there, just reminds me. But so this is sort of a bubblegummer one. This is a slave blanket that has a saltillo design. I know I'm way too far from you guys, but let me just go ahead. And so I have one made by the same maker, very similar to that. And then this is another one that's a real famous slave blanket in the Barton collection. So he was a real fan of them. So anyway, we're going to look at blankets now, and so we'll try to tell you stories about them as much as we can. I have divided my slave blanket collection into types, and so we're going to follow that idea of the types that I'm using just because I can. And so there's basically 2 types. There's ones made for the saltillo market. So the Navajo weavers were probably taken to Mexico and made to weave for the Mexican market. And they were kept in New Mexico also. Now, there is an incident where a group of Hispanics that had with them a group of Navajo women were accosted by U.S. troops down near the Mexican border, and they asked what they were doing with the Navajo women, and they heard sort of nebulous sort of answers that they didn't like, and so they started investigating who these guys were and why they had, 10 or 12 Navajo women of weaving age with them. And all of a sudden, it turned out that a couple of the Hispanics had friends with officers at Bosque Redondo. So they completely dropped the investigation.
What year was that?
What year was that? During Bosque Redondo, which would be 1863 to 68, 64 to 68. And so, another terrible story, but I think it tells the story. When the Navajos went to Bosque Redondo, they kept several weavers at Fort Defiance to weave blankets for the men so they could keep warm. And that was 1864 and 1865. Another true story I've turned up. The Surgeon General of the United States ordered that the weavers be sent on to Bosque Redondo because of the syphilis rate amongst the men. So there's a lot of stories like that. So, and got to read my book. So anyway, how are we doing? Okay, we're gonna get through the stuff quick. So anyway, in 1977, I was in La Jolla, California, visiting with a dealer. He showed me this blanket. I said, that's pretty cool. Here, let's go this way so we don't see the Velcro on it. So I bought this blanket, I got it home. I thought it was a Mexican serape because it looked like one. I started looking at it, had lazy lines all through the field. And it said, what the hell do I have here? And well, what are lazy lines? Well, lazy lines is a term the Navajos kind of hate. It's a Pueblo term for the Navajo. The Pueblo and Navajo both weave on the same loom, right? And so on a Pueblo will carry the weft all the way from one side to the other side, right? Navajo will weave as far as they can comfortably reach, repositioning themselves or the loom some way and weave. And so they really should be called sectional weaving lines. And a sectional weaving line is a tapestry joint made arbitrarily in the piece. It's the same thing as a design change. And so it's a Navajo trait though. And so, yeah, and you can walk this around and show people and so this is the one I showed Joe Benweed. He said, oh my God, if ever there's a slave blanket, that's it. It has an interesting little braided end on it, but if you take the braid apart, it's looped warped. The other interesting trait is this class of blanket, and this is not a unique, this is a class of blanket. There's probably 30 or 40 of these in existence that I found in different museums. And so it's 2-ply handspun wool warp, which is a Rio Grande warp. So it's Navajo, you know, loom, Navajo weaver, and Rio Grande warp and Saltillo design. And so this dark color is indigo blue, and the brighter colors in it are early Germantown yarns.
So you would date that about 1860?
65, 75, I'd say, because of the aniline colors in it.
So are you testing for aniline versus?
To me, by 1865, it's all available. It's unimportant. You know, these guys all want their dye tests, and they make such a big deal out of it now. I feel like they're going to put their dye tests on the wall and put the blanket in a trunk. And I tell people that. It's all available. It's the art that makes it special. I'm an art dealer, and so it's how beautiful the colors work with the piece that's more important to me. Now, there's a lot of people that would argue with me, and they hate my idea, but that's basically it. So anyway, here, let's do this for a second. Let's just lay this out like this so we can see it, because somewhere about a year or year and a half later, I found this blanket. And so it contains what I call a fingerprint of the weaver. It's the same weaver. They're exactly the same length. And I remember talking to an Oriental rug guy sometime, and I said something about the fingerprint of a rug, and he said, you idiot, there don't fingerprints on textiles and all this stuff. I tried to explain to him, I was really using the term differently, but no, he hated me by then. But it was really interesting because I found this about a year later, and I obviously recognized it was the same weaver. And so I've found 2 more by the same weaver in the last that many years, but I found this one pretty right away. So pretty cool, huh?
Pretty cool.
Pretty cool. I was pretty thrilled, I remember. So anyway, these were probably made by Navajo weavers that were taken to Mexico. I have theories about this, but I don't have any evidence or any proof, so I'm not really going to go there until I can prove it, but I'm out to try to prove it. I'm pretty sure I've resolved it, and even where they even went, where they kept the Navajo weavers and everything, but I'm not going to say that until I get a little more proof. Here's another example, but a really beautiful one. So this is the same idea. It's got the same braid on the end. It's the same lazy line structure, but probably not the same weaver. And so we've come up with a term that we use when we are dealing with saltillos and things like that. We call them point specific. So we don't know if it's the same weaver, we don't know if it's the same workshop, but it's the same something. So.
What's the thread count on that?
I'd have to count it.
Give or take?
But I'd say the weft would probably be about 60 or 70 wefts.
Seems really fine.
Yeah, it's pretty fine. Here you can see a little closer. But I might have a handy dandy counter.
Continuous warp, how do they adjust the tension on the edge?
On the sides?
Yeah.
Well, generally, they would bundle the outer warps so they could pull enough tension when they string the loom up, so when they're pulling it,
Bundled, okay.
yeah. And so that's Hispanic loom. Navajos usually have braided selvage edges, are what they're called. And so,
Okay, I'm with you.
okay. Does that make sense? So this is a very beautiful one of these, and Chris commented on it nice, but I have probably 5 I probably have 5 of these that are this coloration.
This is wool
Oh yeah,
from what animal?
sheep. So whatever.
How much is it worth?
How much is it worth? It's not an economics class. How much do I think it's worth? No, I think these are very valuable, and there's only a handful of them in existence. So, but anyway, here, this is a little bit different one, but you know, there quite a few of them are different. This is the one I sold to Larry Frank, and after Larry died, I bought it back from Ross. I hated that I always sold it. This one's, of all of them, has the most kind of Rio Grande traits. It has kind of the Brazil wood gold, and it's a little heavier weave. And it has beautiful indigo green and indigo blue. Yeah, now this one's easy. Pardon?
Why do you think this, why do you know this one is a slave?
Well, here's the answer to that question. It's Navajo woven. Would you agree with that?
Yeah.
Lazy lines? Okay. Why wouldn't a Navajo weave it and then wear it?
It has a slit.
No. Why wouldn't a Navajo weave it? Anybody want to answer that question? Why wouldn't a Navajo make this blanket and never wear it? It makes as much sense as a Marine killing an ISIS guy and dressing up in his uniform. He's going to get shot by another Marine as being an ISIS. So if a person wearing this blanket at a distance to a Navajo is going to be a Mexican. And so they're not going to ride up and make sure it's safe. They're going to shoot him at a distance. Guns can do that. So that's the most logical thing I have, is it's cross-cultural. You know, the only Navajo that would wear this is somebody that would want to be cross-dressing, and that would be unsafe in the Southwest.
So, Mark, how do you think that this cross-cultural exchange took place? I mean, it was very informal, right? So do you think an owner, a slave owner, would say or indicate to the weaver, you know, here's a blanket I bought in Saltillo. I want you to make one like it.
Of course. So I said this earlier. I love good questions. That's a very good question. I said this earlier, but maybe y'all didn't catch it yet. A slave blanket represents the relationship between the captive and the captor.
Yes.
And that relationship can be as broad and as varied as you can possibly imagine. So it's never one thing. It's
I think they had some kind of like a book from Spain or wherever.
No, they just, it's just,
tapestry,
no, I think they just knew what was popular. They, you know, they saw Joe Blow down the street that had something that was pretty cool, and now you got a Navajo that can weave one, and you tell them to do it. But, you know, what you had made for your wife would be different than what you had made for your children, or what you had made, your grandfather wanted one. So basically, they were dictating, you know, what they did.
and also for a market.
And actually for a market, yeah. But, you know, the practicality was probably a little bigger than the market, but, you know, but money is always good, comes in handy. And so that's it. And so it's in an innumerable amount of relationships that this caused. And that's why when we look at these, I'll tell you kind of what I think, but it's just a million relationships. And, you know, and so some guy would just go, make me one of those things you make because I want to go sell it and make money. Or a lot of times it was probably very specific what was made, and the size of what it was, and the coloration and everything.
These are her favorite colors. That's something he would appreciate.
Yeah, and so, and what dyes they actually were able to get, and it's just, there's so many factors. And I mean, I've made myself crazy for the last 30 or 40 years, this, and I wake up in the middle of the night and I write all these crazy things about all these relationships that went on with all these people.
Good for you.
Yeah, no. And so it's nuts. And so, oh, I'm not at that blanket yet. I don't even think it's here. But anyway, so these are made for the Mexican market. Now we're getting more for the Rio Grande market.
Mark, I have a question that relates to something you said about the last rug.
Yeah.
I wove and I did a lot of indigo dyeing. You used the term green indigo.
Yeah.
What is
It's dyed yellow first and then given a bath in the indigo. And so you can actually see some of the yellow fiber that doesn't get it. And depending on the color of yellow or the color of blue, it can be really pale green. It can be really deep, dark, beautiful green. That good? Yeah. I made it up. Yeah. So anyway, this is one, again, I bought years ago, and I just was so impressed with the unusual coloration of it. So so the red is all bayetta in this, and this is a recarded bayetta. Now I will say, absolutely, especially for somebody that knows about weaving, this is my opinion. And so this is my speculation, but it's very educated speculation because I have owned 35,000 blankets, and I've been going to show for years and looking at stuff with this idea in mind to look at traits that I think would be Hispanic. So, this is just doesn't have the boldness of Navajo blankets. Tomorrow we'll look at Navajo blankets. They're very bold. You start seeing these pastel-y things. It's Hispanic. So, this one has a bunch of these little blue wefts in it. Little red wefts in it, all over it. It's prolific all through it. Can you guys see those back there? Yeah. Yeah. And so I have my own idea what those mean, but let's stick to our blankets. So, what is bayetta? Well, bayetta is a Navajo term for cloth that they took apart. Now, the Navajo was the red man in the red land, of broken red mesas and everything. So they were fascinated with red, but they never had a dye source for it. The Spanish did, and it was cochineal, and it was very expensive. As a matter, it was the second most valuable export ever out of the New World, second only to precious metals. Pound for pound, worth similar to silver. It's a little red, it's a little scale insect that lives on the nopal cactus, and it was the rage of Europe. It produced the best red ever known by man, the most color fast and the strongest red.
Do you know that we have cochineal here up in Taos?
We do now, yeah. It wouldn't have been there 150 years ago. But with the climate change, we're seeing it up. You had a ranch in Arbalise right on Lake Navajo, and I had cochineal on my property there too. So, but yeah, you can see it, and it's a little scale insect. It looks like it's kind of cottony, white-looking stuff, and if you ever go look on those and you can pull it off and squeeze it, boy, it'll be bright red between your fingers, and it'll stain your fingers too. So anyway, you can kind of get the idea of this one. You guys know I love wearing them. So anyway, what? 15 minutes, holy cow. We're gonna get through all these in 15 minutes. We're gonna have to go quick, guys. Real quick. So here is sort of typical Navajo blanket made for the Hispanic market, because those are just not Navajo colors. And so a lot of times the coloration, which we're not going to get to see as many of them as we want, is purple, red, orange, or red, orange, purple. I call it rope, R-O-P. And it's a common coloration in a lot of these blankets. Now this one I bought had a really old tag on it, and it said 1936 slave blanket. Wow. So that was kind of fun. But really what told me it's a slave blanket is the coloration. These are Rio Grande Hispanic colors. No, some Navajo is not going to wear this blanket. So we'll go fairly quickly here. But
Sorry, I have another question, yet another.
That's fine.
So the selvage edges are also finished in an interesting way. Is that always typical of a slave blanket?
Well, every Navajo blanket selvages are finished in a different way. There is a Navajo way that maybe a grandmother would have taught the daughter or granddaughter, but basically once they do it, they start doing language things. But these are not very typical Navajo selvage edges.
They're
here.
not?
Oh, no, they are.
Okay, it looks like an overcast stitch to me, like by hand.
Well, yeah, but it's not. It's actually done while it's on the loom.
Okay.
So it's woven into the piece.
Okay.
So the selvage is attached before the piece starts to get woven. So this is just another one, great piece. And, and I saw this at one of the White Hawk shows about 3 or 4 years ago. And I saw it on the bottom of a stack. And I used to like to go in the early mornings before any of the dealers came, which you can get in early if you want to. And it's a great time to pick up things, the prices are a lot better. So I saw this sitting in a stack, just a little tiny bit of it, and I'm going, wow, that's a slave blanket. And I walked over and got it, and I kind of know the dealer. He was a guy from Denver, and of course I took it out from the stack and looked at it, and he said it had on it slave blanket. So I said, why do you think it's a slave blanket? He goes, I don't know. I don't even know what a slave blanket is. It just seemed like it to me. And I thought, you were right, buddy. Good thing. He was a really smart guy. So here's another, banded Navajo blanket, but this has all the ticking and everything of a Rio Grande blanket. And a lot of the red in this is recarded bayetta. Now, did I finish your bayetta question? Yeah, I'm sorry, I got distracted. But anyway, so the Navajos would, in their rating of the, who asked the question? Was it? Okay. So the Navajos, when they would raid the Spanish villages, they take any piece of red cloth they could come up with, anything that was red. And they take it back to the ladies, and the ladies would painstakingly take it apart strand for strand, and they would use it back in the blankets for the color. Now, it depends on the weight or the dimension of the material being used. It could be a single strand of it. They could ply it back together. I've seen as many as 8 strands of bayette applied together for a single weft. But if it was a kind of heavier material, they can be single too, so really anywhere in between. But it was just used for the color. And they never, until they were able to get either commercial yarns or things. So basically, the first mention of red in a Navajo blanket in a Spanish document was in 1780. They mentioned them using red. The dresses that they made, they used 2-panel dresses they made before that were described as being brown-bodied with blue end panels. And in 1780, they mentioned the Navajo as actually wearing red. So the red obviously came from the bayetta material. Now, I happen to own a Navajo dress that is brown and blue. And Joe Ben Wheat called it the earliest piece of Navajo weaving. And it came from a cave right up above where my trading post is, but years ago. And I didn't know that until much after we had the post, that that's where it came from. And so when the Navajos came to go through our collection after I gave it to Fort Lewis College to repatriate, I thought we'd lose it because the history went back to the reservation and everything. Here's this beautiful early blanket, unbelievable. And so I thought I lost it. And so anyway, old Mr. Begay, he took one look at that blanket and he goes, oh my God. And all he saw was his great-grandmother's chindies all over that dress. He wanted nothing to do with it. He goes, oh yeah, they take those dresses off and they lay them everywhere. We don't want anything to do with that. I thought I lost it for sure. But thank you, Mr. Begay, we still have it. So now those are banded blankets. So the next type I go to are banded and designed. So here we see, in this particular example here, typical Navajo classic designs done in a banded blanket. What we call terrace stepping designs, like I said. So this is just a classic Navajo serape design, all done in pastel colors. Again, the same, oh sure. The same question you asked, why wouldn't a Navajo wear this? Because they're gonna get shot by another Navajo for being Hispanic. I mean, that's just, so this is what I call the bubble gummers. This is what Harry Mira identified as slave blankets. This was sort of, most all of them he showed, but one were this type. And most of those are still at MIAC now. So.
But you know that was DNA woven because it's forced selvage?
Yeah, it's forced selvage and it's lazy lines.
And continuous warp.
And continuous warp. So it's got all the Navajo traits. So here's another one. Like I say, I'm the first one to say it's my decision. And that doesn't make it true, it just means it's my opinion. And so I know it's going to be a very speculative book and I'm going to get all kinds of flack for doing it, but I think I'm showing a real interesting side of Navajo things. So this is a pretty cool one here. And so again, it's pure classic Navajo design, stepped, and see here we go. Those are the step triangles that Joe Ben Wheat talks about. being pure classic, that the earliest use, that doesn't make this the earliest. It's just a very traditional weaver that's only using step terrace designs and bands. But then that beautiful yellow and the orange and everything's like, ah! So, anyway, here's another, this is another great bubble gummer. I took great pride when I would find these. I'd say, oh my God, I'd see them a mile away. But here's one. Now this is one that does not have the side selvage. This says bundled outer warp similar to a Hispanic blanket. And, you know, I'm sure that the owner said, well, I don't want that Navajo crap on there and that selvage, you know, just do it, make it look like a Hispanic blanket. You know, I don't want them to think some Navajo made my blanket. So this one, as quite a few do, I'll try to point them out. This just has bundled outer warps in a typical Rio Grande fashion.
But we can't see from back here. Does it have lazy lines?
Oh yeah. Some, you know, not always. Sometimes that's one thing that's left out. And so when you see it, there's no like one rule or one blanket. They're all individual things. Yeah. Well, that's another topic. And so I'll show you a great one. I have to jump ahead to do it because I think this is a great one, and this shows what they did. And we're out of my regional style, but this has looped warp fringe on both ends. See? And it loops back through. So the weaver had to take a rod, a piece of stick or something, and once the loom was up, they put that in there to space it, and when they started weaving, they weaved the web of the blanket against whatever they had in there. Now, it's not enough that that's how it's done, but it's done the same way on the other side. So it was totally planned out. See, here's the other side, has the same looped warps. And so that's a great trait for me. I love seeing that trait where I see looped warp ends on both. Now, sometimes the fringes get cut, so they're not always still looped, but this is looped warped. So this is a great example of them doing that. And so this shows, you know, nice terracing. It's typically what we call a moki. This one does have selvage. Oh yeah, so this is looped warp. So like I said, when they got the loom set up, they had to put something in there, and they started weaving against whether it was a rod or a stick or something, so they're weaving against that in a precision amount that they figured how to do it on the other side too. So this is totally conceived. Yes, ma'am?
In doing that, when they were setting up the continuous warp, would they usually twine something between the threads, between the warp threads, to hold them in place, and then put the rod?
No, I don't think they needed to. I think they just needed something to batten against. I mean, weavers, you know, the weavers know, I've never woven one yet, but who knows, I'm young. But no, I don't think they needed to. I just think, and the weaver, we see weavers still do this now. They do it on saddle blankets often to do the fringes on saddle blankets. You see this looped warp ends a lot in the Navajo saddle blankets. Oh, do I have to? How's that, guys? Now, normally, because we are kind of running out of time. Isn't that wonderful? So we're running out of time, so I'm going to have to run through them. So anyway, it's beautiful. They're beautifully, I mean, it's very well conceived, so the design works exactly like it just did. So now this is a real cool one. I just love this one because this is the classic red, orange, purple, the rope, I call it. And I never noticed it until fairly recently, how many of my different slave blankets are red, orange, purple. Here's a great example. And the red in this is raveled, recarded. It's cochineal dyed. And the orange would be, so the first two synthetic dyes that were distributed out to the Southwest were orange dye number 5 and what were called fuchsin. And so this is really a deep purple, but it was real, faded real easily. So it looks like a gray, but it actually is very purple.
Oh, wow.
And then the red is tested cochineal. So kind of a really fun blanket, I think. And so this to me screams slave blanket.
So is it safe to say if you find a blanket that has these colors, you're immediately thinking it's probably a slave blanket? Or is there a parallel tradition?
No, it's got to be numerous things. It can't just be one thing. Because, I will show in my book a whole group of Rio Grande blankets that are red, orange, purple.
That's what
So,
I was getting at.
yeah, so I'm going to show that to say this is real common Hispanic coloration that we see.
It was the fashion of the time.
What's that?
It was the
Fashion of the time, exactly. Anyway, so this is another beauty. This came out of Taos here from a dealer. And this is just a really fun blanket because this is all, okay, I'll get the Velcro. So this is all Navajo terraced triangles, a little bit of, what?
That's on a small loom.
Yeah, this is off of a Rio Grande loom. So, it's a Navajo to weave on a Rio Grande loom, that is not any problem at all for them. It's a little harder to get a Hispanic to weave on an upright loom, but basically, if they're weavers, they can, it's the insertion of design and everything is exactly the same, so they can go either way. But this is just a beautiful classic serape center that this has. So, and then I know somebody's going to ask if I don't do it.
It's 5 minutes.
Boop. Boop. I'm not, for 5 minutes, I'm doing really terrible. Isn't that nice down the center of the back like that? Am I in the middle of the back, by the way? Okay, yeah. Before I brag about it. It is. This is off a Rio Grande loom. So, if you had a Rio Grande loom in your Hispanic house, you put your Navajo to weave at that because you didn't want to necessarily have a native blanket. I mean, you got to think about this in the terms of an endless number of human possibilities that they went on. And that's the main thing. It's not one thing, it's 1,000 different relationships between the captive and the captor. But that's the key relationship, is the captive and the captor. So I'll just skip through so here's one that's kind of really classy Hispanic coloration in Hispanic dirt. It's kind of grubby on one side. Yeah, I was happy because it's got kind of grubby. But see, so there's a great Saltillo diamond and all the serrate designs. And again, you can let me just take this and just put it on and see. Oh. So it has all the traits of a Navajo blanket, but this is Hispanic coloration. This is what you see in the Rio Grandes. And generally, when you see Navajo blankets that have these kind of colorations, they have other traits that make them. So now this is a fun one here, because I'm going to have to jump ahead. Maybe I should even do this. Let me go a little further here. Now let's take this blanket. This is a documented slave blanket. The Navajo was from around Gallup, and she was captured. She was taken to Ocate, which is out, somebody of you know more about where Ocate is. And she was in Mondragon, I think, family in Ocate, and they did a estate sale in the 1930s or so, and they had the weaver name and all the information on her. So this is a documented slave blanket. We know about the Navajo weaver that made it. And I bought this years ago from a gallery in Santa Fe, and they had all that history, and I loved it. And They thought it was a little too plain and wasn't worth anything, and I just walked out. I died. This is one of the documented ones. So obviously, it's every relationship. There's just not one thing. But this is one of the more recently found 10. Now here's a really fun one. I bought this at Sotheby's 35 years ago or something. And it was in like a secondary sale, it wasn't in their primary sale, and I went down, I think I paid $2,500, or I mean $250 for it. I couldn't have been happier.
No.
So that's a classic Saltillo design, center diamond, border design, and red, orange, purple. So,
What are the diagonal lines that we're seeing?
the lazy lines.
Those are,
Those are the lazy lines. So they should be called sectional weaving lines. But the Pueblos, picking on the Navajos, called them lazy lines because they said since they wouldn't carry their wefts all the way across, they were being lazy.
Now, is this all natural dye?
No, those would be synthetics. The field is, yeah, it's just natural gray, yeah. It's just combed gray, and so, you know, you just get that nice natural striation. Yeah, it's beautiful.
That looked good under blue light, one of those blue lights.
Yeah, yeah. So let's go. So anyway, here, so one of the blankets that is a slave blanket is what we call a wedge weave. And an earlier term for it was pulled warp, but that was a little bit deceptive because they weren't really messing with the warp. They were weaving. And so this is a very early, these types of blankets were real early Navajo attempt to do serrate design. They didn't necessarily know how to do it. So this is actually woven that way. So rather than weaving in a serrate pattern, which the Spanish understood, the Navajo actually wove diagonally. So they started right here, there's the wedge, and then the rest of the weft is packed against the wedge. Now, when you take them off the loom, because of the tension between the weft and the warp, they will have a tendency to pull out of shape, hence the term pulled warp, because the warp gets pulled slightly out of shape. And a lot of these that are sloppier, this happens to be a beautifully fine one, and this is sort of a classic Bosque Redondo style center. So, am I out of time? But I'm going to keep going. Everybody can leave if they want. In the meantime, we're going to look at blankets. So here's a more classic wedge weave here. And so this is sort of it's a diamond center. And so this one is an unusual type of wedge weave because it's what we call pulled off the center. So the center is straight tapestry, but then the wedges go back and forth on both sides.
My friend and I want to know, so you throw it on over your shoulders, it looks fantastic, but back in the day, would a Spanish person, an Anglo person do that? Throw it over and wear it?
Until they got heaters in their pickup trucks, they would.
Throw it on over whatever they were wearing and put their hat back on, right?
Yeah, they became very fashionable at, wearing them.
Well,
It wasn't.
I'd love to wear one, but
Yeah. I mean, you had to have one to survive in the Southwest. If you were traveling, you had to have one.
So you didn't just put it on your bed? You didn't just put it on your bed?
Well, I didn't say couldn't,
Well, no.
but I'm sure if you weren't out on your horse, you might be in bed. I mean, you just have to think logical about how people lived, yeah. And of course they would sleep under their blankets. That's what we would sleep under. So, yeah, it's more common sense than you think. People like to make it more complicated. It's not really that complicated, So, now we have Sears and Roebuck. You can go buy these blankets. Yeah, Pendleton, yeah. But just one? No, I can go more than one. Let's see, where do you really go? So anyway, the Navajos, this is a child's slave blanket. And this is a very interesting piece because this is this is made on a Rio Grande loom, and so it's one half panel of a usually 2-piece Rio Grande. And so it's got bayetta and plied yarns, and it's got a fake selvage added to the side put on, because the Navajo weaver, although she was weaving on a Rio Grande loom, wanted it to have selvage. And then it has on the ends the warps that would have extended past the body of the piece or been tucked back in. Very unique. And this was collected in the 1870s by a military officer who was out here. So this has really good collection history. And so now here's another child's piece. And this, we talked about a little earlier. This was collected by Roy Robinson, was that his name? And he had a big sale at Bonham's. I think it brought $5-6 million. He had all kinds of Indian art from all over everywhere. And so this, I bought it with a little group of stuff in there, and it had a tag. And so he bought this in 1920. He documented everything. It was super good. Had a little tag attached to the corner that said slave blanket. So that could be the very earliest mention of a slave blanket.
1920?
1920. Mention of it. Yeah.
But slave blanket is sort of a coined phrase. That's kind of interesting that.
Yeah. That he actually said it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because it's the first time I've seen anybody ever say it in any kind of print. So there's one more class I'd love to show you guys, unless you're too bored. And these are what are called Bosque Redondo blankets. And these were made mostly, and this one in particular was made for a military officer out of northern Colorado who was stationed at Bosque Redondo, and he had a weaver make it for him. So this one is documented to Bosque Redondo. And mostly these are made out of the earliest types of Germantown yarns. And so it's a classic serape, but it has all the unusual coloration. And so I'll have a chapter in the book on these particular Bosque Redondo blankets, because whether they were enslaved, you consider it enslaved or not, but they were suppressed weavers weaving for somebody else. So I'm going to show you a few of them here real quick. This is a beautiful one, but this one's documented. I got it out of the Colorado Museum of Natural History. I got them a first phase, so they were happy to let me trade whatever I wanted, because they never had a first phase. So this is another really good. Now, often these blankets are really long and narrow, and I thought that was really unusual.
It's an army cot.
Well, not only that, no.
It's the size and length of an army cot.
Well, yeah, but not only that. Okay, have you ever seen military issue blankets that were issued to a military in the 1860s?
I grew up in the 60s in Alaska, and we had a lot of military service.
Yeah, and so a military blanket was like a Pendleton blanket, but twice as long. And so you would lay it down in your bed, and then you'd have plenty of blanket to pull over the top of you, you know. And so those were the military issue blankets to the military at Bosque Redondo. And so this is kind of emulating that with its huge size. And I've even seen these 2 feet longer than this, but the same width. So this is all early, what are called Germantown yarns. And the reds are still cochineal and stuff, but you get a nice variation. Now here's a real cool one I've had for years of the Bosque Redondo pieces. And I've never been able to solve the problem with this. But this one's huge and long. Now this is the red material in this. We're going to get real technical, and maybe I'll explain it a little more tonight. It's what's called hard worsted lac dyed. This is the first type of bayetta that was used, although this blanket would date later. The red is all this very early type of bayetta, and then the other colors are what we're called Saxony. It's very silky commercial yarns. So since this was made probably by about 1865, it's the first image of an American flag on a Navajo blanket. And I've never been able to, I've been through all the, let's hold it up. MR. And so I went through the military records and everything looking for an MR. I haven't found one yet. But he could have been some kind of a congressional person or somebody like that. There was a lot of people out there that could have got a blanket made like this for him.
He could have been a sutler.
Yeah, it could be anybody. But made at Bosque Redondo, he probably was associated with the military. Now this is just kind of a fun Bosque piece, just because it's so elaborate. And mostly they're Germantown. This one happens to be hand spun. But damn if it isn't red, orange, purple.
You're doing the Velcro.
Oh, okay. Let's hold it up high.
Oh, wow.
Isn't that a beauty? So obviously when you put this on, it's fabulous, but it's huge, which is pretty typical of these Bosque pieces to be really large. So anyway, I won't bore you any longer, except, yeah. So this is one more. This is Navajo woven in the style of a Rio Grande. It has the lack of side selvages and bundled outer warps to even make it look like a Rio Grande. And then it has all the coloration and everything of a banded and designed Rio Grande blanket, but it's huge. Yeah, you see the Navajo and you really see the Rio Grande, so cross-cultural. And there's a little green in here. You can't really see it back, but this is a green, little tidbits of green in it. So, well, I'm sorry we've run out of time, but it was a lot of fun. You guys were a great audience. And good questions. I like those. So anyway, tomorrow night we're talking about Navajo blankets, and if you want to get your socks blown off, I have great Navajo blankets.